Gerda Lerner, The Majority Finds Its Past, Placing Women in History. This book is dedicated to my students, a new generation of women who take for granted the time and space for thought we had to win, in faith and trust that they will carry on. Preface. Most of the essays in this volume originated as lectures or conference papers. They were transformed, often through several versions, in response to audience reaction, criticism, and challenge from colleagues. Most scholarly work is subject to such beneficial exchange among scholars, but the quality and nature of feminist scholarship, at least as I have experienced it in the field of women's history, is something quite different. We who create women's history, as we seek to uncover the female past and interpret it, are often an embattled lot, struggling for the right to teach what we research and to win professional recognition, not only for our work, but the field in which we work. Our professional contacts with other feminist scholars therefore take on a significance far greater than that of the traditional scholarly exchange. We have become a community of scholars, vitally invested and involved in each other's work, trying to combat within ourselves and one another the competitiveness which is structured into our institutional and professional life, and to substitute for it a new, as yet untested model of supportive and engaged scholarship. Feminist scholarship seeks to respect individual work, while searching for collective solutions to intellectual as well as societal problems. It seeks to break down and combat the artificial hierarchies, the elitism, and narrow specialization so characteristic of our profession. It seeks constantly to broaden and deepen the connectedness between thinking and committed social action. The history we study offers us models for the kind of people we are trying to become, and so some of the deep splits in personhood from which so many of us have suffered are healing. Thus, in preparing this volume of my own past work, I am above all aware of an indebtedness far greater than can be acknowledged to my students, my lecture audiences, my colleagues in and out of academia, in short, to my sisters in women's history. This work, whatever else it may be, represents an ongoing, continuing dialogue among many of us, concerning issues and questions as vital to our future as to our present. As I have all my life in different fields, I have in this work at times stood in opposition to prevailing trends, seemingly alone. Yet I have never felt myself disconnected from that rising stream of consciousness, will, and force which seeks to have women realize their full human potential. It would be impossible to list here and acknowledge my indebtedness to all the individuals whose thought, help, and support has made this work possible. Let me simply say that I feel myself embedded in the collective effort and that I hope my own, sometimes lonely explorations have added to its strength. I am grateful to Sheldon Meyer for his understanding and skillful editing of this volume, and to Leona Capeless for her perceptive copy editing. A brief note on method. The essays, which have previously been published, are here reprinted with some cuts made to avoid repetition. In a few places, ideas and concepts have been sharpened in the light of recent scholarship. In other places, I have, from my current vantage point, critically commented in the footnotes on my earlier work. All bibliographical footnotes have been updated to bring them in line with recent scholarship. The terms of reference by which blacks have referred to themselves have changed in the course of history. In recognition of the emotional and symbolic significance of the choice of a name, which is part of self-definition for individuals as well as for groups, I have used the terms generally accepted by the group at a given time. Thus the term Negro is used when referring to the Negro Women's Club movement, while in other places black is the term of reference. When the word black means Negro, I have capitalized it when used as a noun, but not as an adjective. Should the use of the word black for Negro persist, it will undoubtedly be capitalized in the adjectival form, but such usage is still rare. A similar wide range of usage with sensitive connotations concerns the term ladies and women. Here I use ladies to designate members of the leisured or upper and middle classes, and women to refer to all others. In the spelling of woman suffrage and woman's rights, I retain the usage current at the time of origin of the 19th century, as I do in referring to the 20th century women's movement. G.L., Tompkins Cove, New York, April 1979. Autobiographical notes by way of an introduction. The essays in this volume were written over a span of 11 years in an attempt to develop a theory of women's history. The first of these essays appeared in 1969, shortly before the birth of the then new women's movement, and before most activists of the new feminism had begun to raise the demand for the restoration of the female past. Thus, this volume represents not only the personal intellectual growth of an individual historian, but also stages in the growth of a new field. In some ways, these essays contributed to the common consciousness, challenging earlier held beliefs and assumptions. In some ways, they represent an individual's answers to questions posed simultaneously by many historians. Clearly, the very terminology used challenges and poses problems. Is the past gender determined? Can there be a separate history of men and women? And what is the content and meaning of the term women's history? Even in its surface meaning, the term women's history calls into question the claim to universality, which history generally assumes as a given. If historical studies, as we traditionally know them, were actually focused on men and women alike, then there would be no need for a separate subject. Men and women built civilization and culture, and one would assume that any historical account written about any given period would recognize that basic fact. But traditional history has been written and interpreted by men in an androcentric frame of reference. It might quite properly be described as the history of men. The very term women's history calls attention to the fact that something is missing from historical scholarship, and it aims to document and reinterpret that which is missing. Seen in that light, women's history is simply the history of women. The individual concerned with the search for what is missing from traditional history usually conceptualizes the problem that way as a first step. The story of women missing from history is discovered, resurrected, and newly interpreted. Women are made to fit into the empty spaces of traditional history. Once engaged in this enterprise and confronting the vast untapped riches of primary sources, the historian becomes aware of the inadequacy of the concepts with which she must deal, of the limitations or inapplicability of the traditional questions she is asking. The search for a better conceptual framework for the history of women begins at that stage. One is led step by step to new definitions, to the search for more appropriate concepts, to dissatisfaction with periodization in traditional history. One searches for appropriate comparisons of women with other groups in society. One tries to find new conceptual models, borrowing concepts and tools from other disciplines. Women's history at this stage is no longer only a field, rather it is a methodology, a stance, an angle of vision. Women's history is a stance which demands that women be included in whatever topic is under discussion. It is an angle of vision which permits us to see that women live and have lived in a world defined by men, and most frequently dominated by men, and yet have shaped and influenced that world and all human events. Women's history challenges the androcentric assumptions of traditional history, and assumes that the role of women in historical events, or the absence of women from them, must properly be illuminated and discussed in each and every case. Such an examination can also provide the basis for answering the other questions asked earlier. Is the past gender determined? Is there a different history of men and of women? Another way of posing these questions is to ask, does gender determine a person's experience, activities, and consciousness? Few would disagree with the statement that gender, like class, race, and ethnicity, is one determinant in shaping the individual's life. The difficulty lies in making generalizations based on our one-sided knowledge of the human past. The study of the history of women is a necessity, if only for purposes of comparison. Women's history, finally, is both a worldview and a compensatory strategy for offsetting the male bias of traditional history. It is an intellectual movement of seriousness and considerable range, which aims for a new synthesis which will eventually make its continuation unnecessary. I came into the study of history through my work on a biography of Sarah and Angelina Grimke. As a writer of short stories, articles, screenplays, and 2 novels, I planned to write a fictionalized biography. I was fascinated with the lives and characters of these 2 women, who had not had a biography written about them since 1885. I wanted to make them come alive as persons, as they had come alive to me while reading their diaries and letters. I wanted to trace their development and growth, creatures of society emerging into selfhood, selfless advocates of reform becoming, out of their own needs, organizers of women, and finally creators of feminist thought. They spoke to me in a very personal way, and I wanted to transmit what I received from these women of another century to readers of my day. I had researched for about a year, and I had written 8 chapters, but I was dissatisfied with my lack of research skills. My formal education had ended about 20 years earlier, when I took my matura, the final exam qualifying a student for admission to university training, just after the accession of Nazis to power in Austria. I passed the exam with distinguished honor, but instead of entering the university, I became a refugee, and later made my way to America. Here I married, raised 2 children, and earned my living at every variety of women's jobs. And I always was a writer. It was as good an education as any for becoming a specialist in the history of women. I worked with women at the workplace and in the community, and helped to organize them. I shared the experience of most ordinary women as an unskilled and later semi-skilled worker, as a housewife, a mother, a child-bearer, community activist. In all of these roles and occupations, I met an active and dynamic group of women who worked quietly and without public recognition, usually without pay, and frequently without an awareness of the significance of the work they were doing. I saw community organizations flourish because there were a handful of such women in the community. Political organizations were influenced by their work, yet no one would ever know of their existence through the writings of historians or through the work of fiction writers. At the time in which I began to think of writing the Grimke biography, the movies were showing us as happy housewives puttering around spotless suburban kitchens, while the evil marriage wreckers, who always happened to be career women, gave up their happiness for ambition. The mass magazines and novels were preaching a similar message, which bore little resemblance to the life I knew. I had seen women during World War II, when they were thrust into positions of responsibility in fields in which they had little experience, maintaining the home front economy. I knew the competent work women, even mere housewives, were doing, and so I knew from my own experience that literature, the media, and history did not reflect the realities of women's lives. Earlier in 1955, I had written, together with the poet and playwright Eve Merriam, a musical, Singing of Women, which was performed off-Broadway. It was our idea to revive some of the heroic figures among American women and to celebrate their existence, their actuality. At that time, what we had to say was not exactly popular. The musical, although well received and reviewed, did not have a commercial future. Still in preparation for it, I had read the autobiographies and biographies of the major 19th century feminists. It seemed to me appropriate, and perhaps not quite accidental, that I should undertake to bring to life the two forgotten women who had started the women's rights movement. Although I was intellectually prepared for this task, I was seriously handicapped by my lack of academic training and my inadequate knowledge of American history. My European classicist training had been rigorous and compared favorably with the best American high school and junior college education available, but the existence of the Americas had been barely acknowledged in it. The United States and its history and culture were marginal to the ethnocentric definition of humanist knowledge of pre-World War II Austria. In the 20 years since I had left school, I had been reading voraciously, with the disorganized fervor of the autodidact. By then I knew enough to know my ignorance. Yet the culture shift I had made into a foreign language, a foreign history, and a new and different system of values was in a sense an excellent preparation for the kind of work I would be doing. It was possible in my day to be a European intellectual, excellently trained and credentialed, and yet to be ignorant of the history and culture of several continents. The definition of knowledge and its content was obviously subject to prejudice and bias. It took the best part of my education for me to learn that what I was learning was based on unacknowledged bias and was in need of skeptical scrutiny and revision. What I was learning in graduate school did not so much leave out continents and their people as it left out half the human race, women. I have always stood in awe of scholarship, and never more so than when I decided to formalize what I had referred to as taking courses at the New School of Social Research by enrolling for credit toward a BA. It took 4 years to earn, by part-time study, the 60 undergraduate credits I needed. Appropriately, I majored in history and literature, learning the rudiments of research technique and historical verification. Incidentally, and without any planning or conscious effort on my part, it turned out that every paper I did on any subject whatsoever related to women. Looking over those undergraduate papers in art history, philosophy, literature, poetry, anthropology, history, and classics, I realize now that I ran my own little women's studies major, only there was no such thing in existence then, and there was no name for what I was doing. As my knowledge of historical method increased, so did my dissatisfaction with my manuscript. The discrepancy between the complexity of the historical data and my ability to interpret and fictionalize them became increasingly obvious. Sometime in my senior year, I discarded the 8 chapters of the fictionalized biography, decided to get professional training as a historian, and started all over again to work on a historical biography of Sarah and Angelina Grimke. Note: Gerda Lerner, The Grimke Sisters from South Carolina, Rebels Against Slavery, Boston, 1967, published as a paperback with new subtitle, Pioneers for Women's Rights and Abolition, New York, 1971. While still an undergraduate at the New School, I offered my first course in women's history, Great Women in American History, in the fall of 1962. The minimum required registration for a class was 10 students, and since I could not find 10 people to take the class, it was canceled. I offered it again in the spring of '63, secured a small but sufficient enrollment, which included 2 retired men, and taught it another time in the fall term '63-'64. To my knowledge, this was the first class on the subject, since a short-lived attempt had been made to teach such a class at Radcliffe in the 1930s. That spring I also gave a series of radio lectures on WBAI, entitled Forgotten Women in American History. These were widely rebroadcast across the country and are still heard occasionally today. In the fall of '63, I entered Columbia University as a candidate for the MA and PhD in history. I was 43 years old. My daughter had just entered college, and my son was a senior in high school. My husband was busy with a successful career as a filmmaker and teacher of film. In those days, women my age did not generally attend graduate school, and I was somewhat apprehensive, and so I think were some of my professors. My mentors were my own age or somewhat younger. My classmates were, by and large, the age of my daughter. I had shopped around before selecting a graduate school in order to be allowed to do the Grimke biography as my dissertation. Columbia was the only place where the department chairman was willing to tailor the institutional regulations so as to meet the needs of this eager, somewhat superannuated, and certainly different student. The topic on which I had already been working on for 4 years was quickly approved for my dissertation, and I was permitted to continue working on it even before fulfilling my orals requirements. Due to this flexibility, I was able to earn both graduate degrees in 3 years from the time I entered, completing my coursework, all the required examinations, the dissertation, and teaching for a year at the New School, and for the final year at Long Island University in Brooklyn. In a way, my 3 years of graduate study were the happiest years of my life. It was hard, absorbing work, constant challenges, but mostly it was the first time in my life I had time and space for thinking and learning. I could not have done it so quickly if I had not had a supportive husband and son, who relieved me of many domestic responsibilities. Greedy for knowledge the way only people who have long been denied an education can be, I gave up all recreation, social life, and other interests. I was constantly aware of the 20 years I had lost and determined to compensate for them by increased concentration and effort. More than anything else, I was driven by an urgency to learn what I needed to know in order to carry out a passionate ambition, which by then had taken concrete shape in my mind. During the interview at Columbia, prior to my admission to the PhD program, I was asked a standard question: why did I take up the study of history? Without hesitating, I replied that I wanted to put women into history. No, I corrected myself, not put them into history, because they are already in it. What I want to do is to make the study of women's history legitimate. I want, I said plainly, to complete the work begun by Mary Beard. This announcement was, not surprisingly, greeted by astonished silence. Just what did I have in mind saying I wanted to make women's history legitimate? And anyway, what was women's history? The question set me off into a lengthy explanation, on which I have played variations for the past 15 years. I ended in somewhat utopian fashion. I want women's history to be part of every curriculum on every level, and I want people to be able to specialize and take PhDs in the subject and not have to say they are doing something else. I want women's history respected and legitimized in the historical profession. At the time, this was a fairly preposterous statement to make, not only in view of my late start and insignificant status in the profession, but also in view of the novelty of the enterprise. I must have presented a rather odd picture to my professors, an excitable middle-aged woman, making grandiose statements more appropriate to an immature freshman, and yet unmistakably possessed of some inner urgency. My mentors had the good sense not to oppose me. In fact, they helped me in many ways, but they tried their best to curb my high-flown ambition and settle me down to doing solid scholarly work on my dissertation. I have always appreciated that. It was what I had come to graduate school to learn, and I saw it as good preparation for what I had set my mind on doing. Still, from the beginning, I held a unique position among my fellow students and in the department. Had I been a young woman just out of college, I probably would not have withstood the social pressure, subtle ridicule, constant discouragement, and not infrequently open disapproval. There were no other women there who shared my interest or supported me. In fact, some of the women students were more hostile to my constantly harping on women than were the men. After a while, I made a place for myself and even won the respect of some of the faculty for my knowledge in what one of them referred to as my exotic specialty. But what I learned during those years, over and above what my professors taught me, was a strategy for extracting knowledge about women from whatever sources were presented to me. I developed a set of questions which would elicit information about women, no matter what the subject was, and no matter what the bias of the lecturer. I learned sometimes from my professors, often against them, and much by trial and error, but always I tested what I was learning against what I already knew from living. I was lucky to have had 43 years of living behind me before entering graduate school. It was what enabled me to withstand its blandishments and to extract the maximum amount of useful knowledge from my instructors. I had sense enough to distinguish methodology from opinion, to acquire the former and skeptically test the latter. What I brought as a person to history was inseparable from my intellectual approach to the subject. I never accepted the need for a separation of theory and practice. The pressure of time and my utopian goal were always before me. Early in my undergraduate studies, I had first read Mary Beard's Woman as Force in History. Somehow I was able to disregard her poor presentation, her fervent and sometimes ill-tempered rhetoric, and to connect with her central idea, that women have always been active and at the center of history. I was struck, as by a sudden illumination, by the simplicity and truth of her insight. Mary Beard had arrived at the conviction the same way I had, by herself having been an engaged participant in women's work in society. In her narrative, I recognized a world I knew from experience, a world in which women were active participants in the building of community and of institutions. Mary Beard's quarrel with the feminist theoreticians of her day, and especially with their approach to history, was due to her rejection of the idea that women were primarily victims. She went too far in that, and it led her to disregard large aspects of women's history, the structural, cultural, and sexual subordination of women and their exploitation. Beard's thinking reflects her isolation from criticism by feminist thinkers, her attachment to traditional sexual values, and indirectly the state of feminism during her most productive years. But implicit in Beard's work, whether she fully understood it or not, was the recognition of the duality of women's position in society. Women are subordinate yet central, victimized yet active. Despite the fact that her rhetorical quarrel with the feminist of her day occupies much space in her writing, it is not central to Beard's thesis. Her greatest contribution is the insight that focusing on the concept of women as victim obscures the true history of women. Beard also insisted that the history of women had to reflect the variations in the status of women at any given time, according to class. She did not blink the fact that women have been oppressors as well as oppressed, and that class and sex interests have often been in conflict. Her methodological suggestions, her practice of comparative history, and her drawing on sources from other disciplines such as anthropology and sociology were a revelation to me. Long before the new feminism surfaced, reading Mary Beard raised my feminist consciousness. Essentially, Mary Beard invented the concept of women's studies and women's history. It was Mary Beard, first and foremost, whose critique of an androcentric academic establishment led her to envision new models of education for women. Equal education, for which women have clamored, she wrote, has merely meant the extension to women of men's education in their own history and judgments of themselves. But such history consists of threads selected from men's activities in war, business, and politics, woven together according to a pattern of male prowess and power as conceived in the mind of man. If the women's culture came into this pattern in any way, it is only as a blurring of a major concept. Here was a statement which expressed what during my graduate education I had experienced only vaguely as dissatisfaction with and resistance to what I was being taught. Traditional history fixed women into marginality. I knew and now found confirmation in Mary Beard's writing that this was not the truth. As I began my first library research, I found the Mary Beard papers at the Sophia Smith collection. These papers hold evidence of Beard's efforts for starting a women's studies course at Radcliffe College, and of her protracted work collecting sources for the history of women and establishing a women's history archives. I found there a 2-page listing of questions yet to be answered about women in history, and I found a very few sentences which became my guidelines as I tried to proceed in this endeavor. In a very real sense, I consider Mary Beard, whom I never met, my principal mentor as a historian. Most educated women, as they pass through graduate school, have suffered from the absence of female role models. They have been made to feel their marginality in their numbers, in the rules, regulations, and the hidden old boy network of academia, and most of all, in the content of their studies. The few learned women who made their success in that man's world had to become what Mary Beard called men's understudies. She, for what seemed to her good and sufficient reasons, chose to remain an outsider to academia, challenging it with her writing, and turning, when frustrated, to popular media and broadcasts. Her strategy for bringing women's history into the mainstream was complex. In her own work, she moved from social and labor history to a comparative study of women of different cultures, to a study of women's humor, to a popular compendium of source material on women, to her major monograph. Note: Mary R. Beard, A Short History of the American Labor Movement, New York 1930, On Understanding Women, New York 1931, Laughing Their Way, Women's Humor in America, New York 1934, America Through Women's Eyes, New York 1933, The Force of Women in Japanese History, Washington, D.C. 1953. See also Women's Work in Municipalities, New York 1915. She organized the search for sources, critiqued respected establishment enterprises like the Encyclopedia Britannica, and moved on to proposing, designing, and organizing women's studies courses. She developed a new model for the woman intellectual, fusing theory and practice. Encouraged by her example, I was adapting it to my uses, my own time. Unlike her, I was not willing to choose amateur and marginal status in my profession. In order to write and research the history of women, historians must have the best of traditional training and practice their craft with rigorous skill, and then they must go beyond it. Yet I too searched for a new definition of professionalism, different from the male academic model. As usual, it was easier to know what not to do than it was to know what to do. After my dissertation defense, one of my professors congratulated me and offered what was undoubtedly well-meant practical advice. If I wanted to make a career in the profession commensurate to my talents, I needed only to keep quiet about my so-called specialty and stress the fact that I was a social historian and a specialist in reform history. Once established, I could then do whatever I wanted about women. I never took that advice. It was too late in my life to play career games. I was never going to be department chairman, dean, or president of one of the historical societies. I was never going to be able to make up for the time lost due to my late start. At age 46, I figured I had 20 years in the profession ahead of me, with luck, and so I made a 20-year research plan, which I have followed, with only slight detours to this day. I reasoned I would have to have impact on the academic world in a number of ways in order to make women's history accepted, by actual research and writing, by proving the existence of sources, by upgrading the status of women in the profession, by proving that there existed student demand in this subject, and moving from there to designing courses and graduate programs. I made these plans in 1966 without knowledge of the spectacular progress that would be made in a short time due to the energy, zeal, and creativity of the women's movement and of women's studies. Note: this progress and the rapid advance of women's history scholarship accounted, certainly in some measure, for disproving at least one of my pessimistic predictions. Just prior to the publication of this book, I was nominated for the 1981 and 2 presidency of the Organization of American Historians, an honor which had not been bestowed on a woman for over 50 years. I just planned for myself, and fortified with my shiny credentials, I decided once and for all to stop defending what I was doing. I would just go ahead, do my work, and let it speak for itself. I had the great fortune, all during my dissertation research, of working in the finest private collection of women's history books then in existence, the library of Miriam Y. Holden. Miriam Holden, a member of the National Women's Party since World War I, and a close co-worker of Alice Paul and Margaret Sanger prior to 1920, had dedicated herself to collecting printed sources on women of all nations, which were housed in her New York East Side brownstone. She had also worked with Mary Beard, Eugenia Leonard, and Elizabeth Schlesinger toward establishing a national women's history archives. They had written proposals, curricula, biographies, and position papers. They had nagged college presidents and alumni trustees, and had for the most part failed to make a dent. Miriam Holden opened her superb library to a few scholars working on women's history topics. I spent many weeks and months there, able to browse freely in works about women and by women spanning 300 years. In this library, the history of women was a reality. The possibilities of comparative and interdisciplinary approaches were evident. Here I connected with the feminist past of thought and activity. Working with such sources, I began to formulate some of the basic questions. In order to clarify my own thinking, I wrote a number of articles. This is the way most of the essays in this book were written: working tools, stepping stones. Revisionist theories usually begin with an argument with one's predecessors. In my case, these predecessors were 19th and 20th century feminist writers who saw women's history as a manifestation of women's oppression and focused excessively on the struggle for women's rights. The most recent, and certainly indispensable book, was Eleanor Flexner's Century of Struggle, which cut a wide swath, although it was essentially written in the women's rights framework. Flexner's essay and footnotes were invaluable in pointing out research directions. I had already followed most of her sources, and now began to formulate my own research priorities. The essay, New Approaches for the Study of Women in American History, number 1, discusses the historiography available in 1969 and poses new questions and challenges. Drawing on Mary Beard, I argued that the idea of the oppression of women, while certainly a historical fact, is of limited usefulness to historical inquiry. More important are questions like, what were women doing? How were they doing it? What was their own understanding of their place in the world? The essay calls attention to the crucially important factors of race and class, and cautions against speaking of women as though they were a unified entity. The Lady and the Mill Girl, number 2, was actually written earlier than New Approaches. It uses comparative history to show how women of different classes experienced the past differently and often antagonistically. It also shows how reality can turn into ideological myth. The essay was in part an outgrowth of my research in antebellum reform movements, in part a response to the ahistorical analysis of women's place in society in a book like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and in some of the early pamphlet literature of the women's liberation movement. It seemed to me essential to show the connection of current events with the past. This essay locates the creation of the feminine mystique in the Jacksonian era, and shows how the ideology of women's places in the home changed from being an accurate description of existing reality into a myth. The essay hints at, but does not solve, the problem of finding a periodization appropriate to women's history. It shows how the Jacksonian age, a period of democratic progress and increasing egalitarianism for men, turns into one of regression and repression for women. The Feminists, a second look, number 3, written in 1970, when the new feminism was just a few years old, subjects the movement and its ideology to comparative analysis with 19th century feminism. The essay is concerned with developing appropriate criteria and calls attention to historic antecedents in 19th century utopianism of many of the most revolutionary-sounding demands of the women's liberation movement. At the time, I still made a sharp distinction between myself as a citizen and active feminist and myself as a scholar of the history of women. I made that distinction even as I helped to organize and served with Bernice Carroll as first co-president of the Caucus of Women Historians, CCWHP, Coordinating Committee of Women in the Historical Profession, in 1969, and as I organized and co-chaired with Patricia Graham the New York Caucus, New York Women Historians. This proves that one can be deeply interested and involved in writing the history of women, be a citizen feminist, and yet not be a feminist historian. My dissatisfaction with the analytic tools available to me continued. I had in 1968 completed a one-volume textbook for high school and junior college use, The Woman in American History. The need for making judgments of selection in a work of this kind, the questions raised by my various editors, and my difficulty in communicating my point of view to them, had forced me to define my concepts more precisely. In Women's Rights and American Feminism, number 4, I tried to develop a more precise terminology. A distinction is made between the women's rights movement, a movement to bring women into all the structures and institutions of male-defined society on the basis of equality, and feminism, a broad-spectrum struggle for female autonomy and self-determination. The essay challenges the appropriateness of traditional periodization for organizing the history of women, and suggests alternatives. Here the influence of Juliet Mitchell's path-breaking essay, Women, the Longest Revolution, is clearly in evidence. Women's role as breeder and childbearer emerged as a factor essential in an ordering of the history of women. The essay also develops more fully the need for separate consideration of class, race, and ethnicity in analyzing women's past. Ever since my dissertation research, which had revealed to me virtually unknown sources of women's history, the idea of doing a source book of primary documents had interested me. I had such a book under contrast with Bobbs Merrill Company as part of their American Heritage series. It was to be entitled Woman in the Making of the Nation. I had begun to organize the research into chapters, arranged quite traditionally according to the major periods of American political history, when I undertook a detour. Just as I had been a premature feminist, I had also been a civil rights activist a good 10 years before the civil rights movement got underway. My commitment to the issue of racial justice was deep and long-standing. My most recent activity in this connection had occurred just prior to my entering graduate school. My husband co-produced and directed the film Black Like Me, based on the best-selling novel by John Howard Griffin. I had written the screenplay and worked on the production with him. After that, I stopped all political and social activity for the duration of my graduate studies. But as I began to work on my research priorities, the absence of black women from history appeared to me as an urgent problem to be considered. In my anti-slavery research, I had uncovered a number of unused sources for the history of black women. Now it seemed to me I would be making a contribution to the civil rights movement and to scholarship by continuing this line of research and publishing a source book for the history of black women. Another reason for making that decision was that there were certain questions I thought could only be answered by comparative history. Was the oppression of women universal? That is, did it go across class and race lines? Did women of different racial groups have the same history, or was there a difference? I obtained permission from Bobbs-Merrill to postpone work on their book so that I might first complete a documentary history of black women. Essays number 5 through 7 are outgrowths of my work on Black Women in White America, a documentary history. In number 5, Black Women in the United States, a Problem in Historiography and Interpretation, I tried to summarize all I had learned theoretically by my research for this documentary and to answer the questions with which I had begun. My comparison between the history of black and white women had confirmed the thesis that generalizations about the oppression of women are inadequate unless qualified by factors of race and class. Women of each racial group experience their historical subordination differently. The community work of black women, number 6, illustrates one instance of community-building work of women. It is typical of many examples of similar activities of black and white women which can be documented. The fact that women of both races, under different circumstances and economic conditions, function in a similar manner seems to confirm that community and institution building is typical of women's work in the past. Black and white women in interaction and confrontation, number 7, subjects the widely held myth of sisterhood among women of both races to a detailed analysis. I had shared that belief and had hoped to substantiate it through my research findings. Instead, I was forced to conclude that, historically, in the U.S. setting, there is more evidence of tension than of sisterhood. The next essay, number 8, The Political Activities of Anti-Slavery Women, although written several years later, similarly seeks to apply the analytical tools of women's history to a concrete problem. In it, I attempted to devise a methodology which would permit me to isolate the activities of anti-slavery women from those of anti-slavery men. I also wanted to test out my thesis that women in 19th century America had done political work and wielded political influence apart from suffrage movement activities and prior to having the vote. While that point is sufficiently proven, much more work and research must be done to develop it fully in a book-length monograph. The essay argues and offers evidence to show that men and women approach their organizational work in different ways and with different emphasis. The historical invisibility of women is often due to the fact that we look for them in exactly the same activities as are pursued by men, and thus we cannot find them. While researching the anti-slavery petitions in the National Archives, I found, by pure serendipity, evidence that the lecture tour of the Grimke sisters in 1837-38 resulted in a great surge of petitioning and organizing activity in the towns and villages they had visited. This should lead to an upgrading of the significance of their organizing work, which earlier was not possible. Just a Housewife, number 9, places an aspect of women's work into historical perspective, which has generally been ignored until the rise of women's history scholarship. The essay sees women's unpaid household work as a primary causative factor in her exploitation in the workplace and in her general subordinate status. The remaining 4 essays, written between 1974 and 1978, mark a decisive change in my intellectual development. After my detour with black women, I returned in 1973 to the book I had under contract with Bobbs-Merrill. But Woman in the Making of the Nation did not progress well, although all the research was in and only the writing remained to be done. In the 4 years since I had first contracted for the book, the field of women's history had grown spectacularly. The profusion of seminars, conference panels, caucus discussions, and symposia in journals characterized the emergence of new scholarship, new questions, revisionist ideas. Women scholars had begun to work collectively, experimenting with methods for sharing their knowledge, for critiquing each other's work in a supportive, non-competitive manner. I was part of that movement and had begun to learn from the many young women who had started on this subject later than I had, but who had brought to it their own ideas and life experiences. I now was critical of the compensatory and contribution history framework in which much of my own work had been cast. It took some months of work before I realized that this was what was wrong with the book. I no longer believed that I should tell the history of women under the title Women in the Making of the Nation. I no longer thought that a chapter organization by traditional periods was adequate. But what to substitute for it? The solution came, as so often happens, in a flash of insight. I found a new title, long before I knew how well it fitted my content. The title, The Female Experience, gave me the clue for reorganizing my research. I gave up the old chapter plan and arranged the material according to female life stages, childhood, youth, marriage, and the single state, etc., and to stages of the growth of feminist consciousness. It was amazing how all at once the same material offered new insights and a powerful illumination. The book was finished quickly. With it came new theoretical perceptions and a transformation which went far beyond the content of the book. What I learned in the process is reflected in the 3 essays which conclude this volume. Placing Women in History, number 10, surveys the historiography of the new field over a span of 5 years. It describes and critiques the stages of consciousness by which historical analysis of women has progressed, from compensatory and contribution history to the new social history, and most recently, woman-oriented history. The essay suggests for the first time that all efforts to treat women as a subgroup, minority, class, caste, are doomed to failure. It also challenges previous attempts at building a single conceptual framework for the history of women. Women are half of humankind, evenly distributed in all strata of society. Their culturally determined and psychologically internalized marginality seems to be what makes their historical experience essentially different from that of men. But men have defined their experience as history and left women out. For women, all history as we now know it is prehistory. This definition of traditional history as not only male-oriented but male-defined is further explored in The Majority Finds Its Past, number 11. What is needed in order to correct the distorted picture presented by traditional history is woman-centered analysis. What would the past be like if women were placed at the center of inquiry? What would the past be like if man were regarded as woman's other? Even to pose such a question, only as an intellectual exercise, shifts one's angle of vision. The very categories and criteria by which historians have ordered the past have become questionable. The possibility of the existence of a female culture within the dominant patriarchal culture cannot be ruled out and should be tested out in each specific case. The final essay, The Challenge of Women's History, summarizes the ways in which women's history challenges traditional scholarship. It offers a radical critique of traditional history and postulates a two-stage development leading to the formulation of a new universal history, a history in which men and women will have equal significance. First, the uncovering and interpretation of the female past. Second, the synthesis of it with traditional history, which would include both the development of patriarchy and the development of feminist consciousness as important aspects of the historical experience. The changes in consciousness and historical thought which led to the definitions in this volume are the work of an individual, yet they reflect a collective effort and owe their existence to the changes in thought and consciousness represented in the women's movement which inspired that collective effort. Women working on women's history have tried to bring feminist consciousness to bear not only on the content but on the method of their work. There has been a deliberate effort to foster the development of women's history by group work, sharing of knowledge and sources, and at times collective research and writing. The flourishing network of women's history study groups, conferences, and conventions, all animated by a spirit of cooperation and the enthusiasm appropriate to pioneers, has greatly accelerated the maturing of this field and of its practitioners. Collegiality has turned into sisterhood, which has for many of us become a meaningful intellectual and spiritual community. The justification for my tracing my personal intellectual growth as an introduction to this volume is that it has significance beyond that of one woman thinking about the past of women. My thinking took place at a time when many other women began to ask questions similar to my own, and began to act on those questions, thereby creating a new context for thought. Feminist consciousness begins with self-consciousness, an awareness of our separate needs as women. Then comes the awareness of female collectivity, the reaching out toward other women, first for mutual support and then to improve our condition. Out of the recognition of communality, there emerges feminist group consciousness, a set of ideas by which women autonomously define ourselves in a male-dominated world and seek to substitute our vision and values for those of the patriarchy. The two aspects of my own consciousness, that of the citizen and that of the woman scholar, had finally fused. I am a feminist scholar. Historians engaged in the quest for shaping autonomous definitions of self, experience, and history are, of necessity, searching for new intellectual tools for our work. We are creating the means as we are defining the goals. We have not, as yet, created the new conceptual framework for the history of women, which will be created. These essays represent my contribution to that effort. They are my working tools and the signposts I have set up along the way on a road of discovery which is leading both into the past and into the future. The Majority Finds Its Past. Chapter 1. New Approaches to the Study of Women in American History. The striking fact about the historiography of women is the general neglect of the subject by historians. As long as historians held to the traditional view that only the transmission and exercise of power were worthy of their interest, women were of necessity ignored. There was little room in political, diplomatic, and military history for American women, who were, longer than any other single group in the population, outside the power structure. At best, their relationship to power was implicit and peripheral, and could easily be passed over as insignificant. With the rise of social history and increasing concern with groups out of power, women received some attention, but interest was focused mainly on their position in the family and on their social status. The number of women mentioned in textbooks of American history remains astonishingly small to this day, as does the number of biographies and monographs by professional historians dealing with women. The literature concerning the role of women in American history is topically narrow, predominantly descriptive, and generally devoid of interpretation. Except for the feminist viewpoint, there seems to be no underlying conceptual framework. Feminist writers, not trained historians, were the first to undertake a systematic attempt to approach the problem of women's role in American life and history. This took the form of feminist tracts, theoretical approaches, and compilations of women's contributions. The early compilers attacked the subject with a missionary zeal designed above all to right wrong. Their tendency was to praise anything women had done as a contribution, and to include any women who had gained the slightest public attention in their numerous lists. Still, much positive work was done in simply recounting the history of the women's rights movement and some of its forerunners, and in discussing some of the women whose pioneering struggles opened opportunities to others. Feminist writers were hampered by a twofold bias. First, they shared the middle-class, nativist, moralistic approach of the progressives, and tended to censor out of existence anyone who did not fit into this pattern. Thus we find that women like Frances Wright and Ernestine Rose received little attention because they were considered too radical. Premature feminists, such as the Grimke sisters, Maria Weston Chapman, and Lydia Maria Child, are barely mentioned. The second bias of the feminists lies in their belief that the history of women is important only as representing the history of an oppressed group and its struggle against its oppressors. This latter concept underlies the somewhat heroic, collectively authored History of Women's Suffrage. This work, probably because it represents an easily available, though disorganized collection of primary sources, has had a pervasive influence on later historians. Following the lead and interpretation of the feminists, professional historians have been preoccupied with the women's rights movement in its legal and political aspects. Modern historians, too, think that what is important to know about women is how they got the ballot. The only serious challenge to this conceptual framework was offered by Mary Beard in the form of a vigorous, though often fuzzy, polemic against the feminists. What is important about women, said Mary Beard, is not that they were an oppressed group, she denied that they ever were, but that they have made a continuous and impressive contribution to society throughout all of history. It is a contribution, however, which does not fit into the value system generally accepted by historians when they make decisions as to who is or is not important to history. Mary Beard undertook in several of her books to trace the positive achievements of women, their social role, and their contributions to community life. Her concepts are most successfully reflected in The Rise of American Civilization, which she co-authored with her husband Charles Beard. In it, the position of women is treated throughout in an integrated way, with great attention to the economic contributions made by women. But the Beard's approach to the subject of women had little influence on the historical profession. Perhaps this was due to the fact that in the 1930s and 40s, both the general public and historians became somewhat disenchanted with the women's rights movement. The winning of suffrage had made only a slight change in the actual status of women, and other factors, technological and economic changes, access to higher education, changing sexual mores, now loomed a great deal larger. The impact of Freudianism in psychology had made reformers in general somewhat suspect. Feminism was not infrequently treated with the same humorous condescension as that other successful failure, temperance. Women have received serious attention from economic historians. There is a good deal of excellent literature dealing with the problem of women workers. Women as contributors to the economy from colonial times on, the laws affecting them, their wages and working conditions, and their struggle for protective legislation have been fully described. Although female labor leaders have not generally been given much attention, their activities are on record. Excellent collections of material pertaining to women at Radcliffe and Smith College are available, but remain insufficiently explored. Modern historians of the reform movements have done much to restore a sane balance to female achievement in reform. Yet one still finds excluded from notice certain women who would have been included as a matter of course had they been men. Sophie Loeb, Grace Dodge, and Mary Anderson could be cited as examples. The historical literature on the family in America is quite scanty, but there seems to be a revival of interest in the subject. Several interesting monographs have begun to deal with the family role of women in various aspects. This approach is promising and should be pursued by other historians. A new conceptual framework for dealing with the subject of women in American history is needed. The women's rights movement frame of reference has become archaic and fairly useless. The 20th century revolution in technology, morality, education, and employment patterns has brought enormous changes in the status and role of American women. These changes demand a historical perspective and understanding. The emergence of a recent new feminism is a social phenomenon requiring interpretation. Most importantly, women themselves are as entitled as minority group members are to having their history fully recorded. Yet the subject is complex. It is difficult to conceptualize women as a group, since they are dispersed throughout the population. Except for special interest organizations, they do not combine together. The subject is full of paradoxes which elude precise definitions and defy synthesis. Women at various times and places were a majority of the population, yet their status was that of an oppressed minority, deprived of the rights men enjoyed. Women have for centuries been excluded from positions of power, both political and economic, yet as members of families, as daughters and wives, they often were closer to actual power than many a man. If women were among the most exploited of workers, they were also among the exploiters. If some women were dissatisfied with their limited opportunities, most women were adjusted to their position in society and resisted efforts at changing it. Women generally played a conservative role as individuals and in their communities, the role of conserving tradition, law, order, and the status quo. Yet women in their organizations were frequently allied with the most radical and even revolutionary causes, and entered alliances with the very groups threatening the status quo. If women themselves acted paradoxically, so did society in formulating its values for women. The rationale for women's peculiar position in society has always been that their function as mothers is essential to the survival of the group, and that the home is the essential nucleus of society as we know it. Yet the millions of housewives and homemakers have throughout our history been deprived of the one tangible reward our society ranks highest, an income of their own. Neither custom, law, nor changes of technology, education, or politics have touched this sacred tradition. The unpaid housewife and mother has affected attitudes toward the women who perform homemaking services for strangers. Traditionally, women in the service trades have been the lowest paid among all workers. Nor has this pattern been restricted to the unskilled groups. When women have entered an occupation in large numbers, this occupation has come to be regarded as low status and has been rewarded by low pay. Examples for this are readily found in the teaching and nursing fields. Even intellectual work has been treated with the same double standard. Creative fields in which women excel, poetry, the short story, have been those carrying the lowest rewards in money and esteem. Only in the performing arts has individual female talent had the same opportunity as male talent. Yet a cursory glance at the composition of any major symphony orchestra even today will reveal that in this field too, opportunities for women have been restricted. In dealing with the subject of women, studies frequently use other distinctive groups in our society as models for comparison. Women's position has variously been likened to that of the slaves, oppressed ethnic or racial minorities, or economically deprived groups. But these comparisons quickly prove inadequate. The slave comparison obviously was a rhetorical device rather than a factual statement, even at the time when Harriet Martineau first made it. While the law denied women equal citizenship and for certain purposes classed them with Indians and imbeciles, it never denied them physical freedom, nor did it regard them as chattel personnel. In fact, even within the slavery system, women were oppressed differently from men. The minority group model is also unsatisfactory. All members of a minority group which suffers discrimination share, with a very few exceptions, in the low status position of the entire group. But women may be the wives of cabinet members, the daughters of congressmen, the sisters of business leaders, and yet, seen simply as persons, they may be disenfranchised and suffer from economical and educational discrimination. On the other hand, a lower-class woman may advance to a position of economic or social power simply by marriage, a route which is generally not open to members of racial minority groups. In one particular respect, the minority group comparison is illuminating. Like Negroes, women suffer from high visibility. They remain more readily identifiable for their group characteristics than for their personal attainments. Modern psychology, which has offered various conflicting theories about the role and place of women, has further complicated the task of the historian. If a social historian wishes to study a particular ethnic or religious minority, he can study its location and economy, its culture, leadership, adjustment to American society, and contributions. The question of psychology would only arise in dealing with personal biographies. But the historian of women is at once faced with the necessity of making psychological judgments. Is it not a basic fact that the psychology as well as the physiology of women is different from that of men? Therefore, they must of necessity have different expectations, needs, demands, and roles. If so, is the difference in rights not simply natural, a reflection of reality? The problems become more vexing when dealing with individual women. The biographer feels obliged, first of all, to concern himself with his subject's sexual role. Was she married, a mother? If she was not, this indicates that whatever she achieved was the result of sexual frustration. If she was married, one is under an obligation to explain that she did not neglect her children, or perhaps that she did. And always there is the crucial question, what was her relationship to her father? This is not intended to disparage the efforts of those biographers who wish to enlist the aid of modern psychology for their work, but it should be pointed out that a great deal of excellent history about men has been written without the author's feeling compelled to discuss his subject's sex life or relationship to his mother in explaining his historical significance. In dealing with women, biographers are impeded by the necessity of dealing first with sex, then with the person. This is an approach which must be examined in each case for its applicability. Where it is useful, it should be retained. Where it is not, it should be discarded without apology. Note, the comments in the above paragraph reflect my then current irritation with the constraints and pressures to which I had been subject on the part of publishers. Several major publishing houses had rejected the manuscript of my biography of the Grimke sisters from South Carolina, rebels against slavery, Boston, Hoofton Mifflin, 1967, because I refused to ascribe the sisters' feminism to their frustrations, failure to find sexual satisfaction, in Sarah's case, and father fixation. This was the heyday of instant pop culture Freudian psychology in fiction, biographies, films. When writing about women, the refusal to use sexual stereotypes as a frame of reference lessened one's chances for publication and for critical acclaim. End note. In order to broaden the study of women in American history, it is not really necessary to suggest new sources. Primary research material is readily available, not only in the several manuscript collections devoted to the subject, but in the usual primary sources for social historians: local historical records, letters, diaries, the organizational records of women's clubs, religious and charitable organizations, labor unions, and fields employing women workers. There are numerous magazines, especially written for women, which provide good source material. Archives of Congress and of state governments contain petitions and statements made at hearings which can yield valuable information about the activities and interests of women. Many of these readily available sources remain neglected. A fresh approach to known material and to available sources could provide valuable new insights. The following suggestion might make a useful beginning. First, the subject, women, is too vast and diffuse to serve as a valid point of departure. Women are members of families, citizens of different regions, economic producers, just as men are, but their emphasis on these various roles is different. The economic role of men predominates in their lives, but women shift readily from one role to another at different periods in their lives. It is in this that their function is different from men, and it is this which must form the basis for any conceptual framework. In modern society, the only statement about women in general which can be made with validity concerns their political status. Therefore, the subject should be subsumed under several categories, and any inquiry, description, and generalization should be limited to a narrower field. It is useful to deal with the status of women at any given time, to distinguish their economic status, family status, and political legal status. There must also be a consideration of class position, as has been usefully proven in recent studies of the feminist movement. Second, we should look at different aspects of women's role in American history. We must certainly be concerned with the women's rights movement, but only as part of the total story. Historians must painstakingly restore the actual record of women's contributions at any given period in history. It is interesting that the history of women before the advent of the feminist movement has been more fully recorded and in a more balanced way than it has afterward, so that the story of colonial women can be quite fully traced through secondary literature. But when we deal with the period after 1800, it often proves difficult to establish even descriptive facts. During the early national period, women organized elaborate welfare and relief systems, which they staffed and administered. This story should be part of the history of the period. It is not now. Women were the teachers in most of the nation's public schools during the 19th century. This is worth recording and exploring. Women made a significant contribution to the growth and development of frontier communities. These are but a few of the many areas in which more research and uncovering of factual information are needed. Third, we might well discard the oppressed group model when discussing women's role in the political life of the nation. Instead, we might start with the fact that one generalization about women which holds up is that they were, longer than any other group in the nation, deprived of political and economic power. Did this mean they actually wielded no power, or did they wield power in different forms? My research has led me to believe that they wielded considerable power, in the middle of the 19th century, even political power. They found a way to make their power felt through organizations, through pressure tactics, through petitioning, and various other means. These later became models for other mass movements for reform. Fourth, another important fact is that women as a group were, for a considerable period of history, deprived of equal access to education. While they were not illiterate, their education was limited, usually to below the high school level. This was true of the majority of women until the end of the 19th century. It might be very useful to investigate what impact this had on female behavior, and more specifically, women's performance as a group in terms of outstanding achievement. To put it another way, how many generations of educated women are necessary to produce a significant number of outstanding women academicians? How many generations of college-trained women are necessary before women in sizable numbers make contributions in the sciences? When do women begin to move from the small-scale, home-centered creative forms, the fiction, poetry, and article writing, to the larger-scale work within the framework of cultural institutions? Is the proverbial dearth of female philosophers really a result of some innate distinctiveness of female mental function, or rather the product of centuries of environmental and institutional deprivation? This type of inquiry lends itself to a comparative cross-cultural approach. A comparison between the educational deprivation of women and that suffered by certain minority groups might lead us to a demonstrable correlation between educational deprivation and a gap of several generations before adequate and competitive performance is possible. This could explain a great deal about some of our problems with minority groups, public schooling, and academic achievement. Note, it is interesting that in approaching my subject in the traditional patriarchal mindset in which I was trained, I seek to justify the study of women by stressing what it might teach us about important subjects, such as the problems of minority groups. I was not then able to justify the study of women and their history as intrinsically valid, or proceed from the firmer assumption that it required no justification. Today I would add to this paragraph, such a comparison would also demonstrate in what ways the subordination of women is of longer duration and more profoundly damaging in effect than that experienced by any other subordinate group. Fifth, it would be worthwhile to distinguish the ideas society held at any given moment in regard to women's proper place from what was actually a woman's status at that time. The two do not necessarily overlap. On the contrary, there seems to be a considerable gap between the popular myth and reality. Social historians might legitimately be concerned with the significance of this gap, how to account for it, and whether it fits any distinguishable pattern. It would also be important to understand the function of ideas about women in the general ordering of society. Was the fact that colonial women were idealized as thrifty housewives and able helpmeets cause or effect of the labor shortage in the colonies? Are the idealized suburban housewife, the fashion-conscious teenager, the sex symbol model, causes or effects of our consumer-oriented society? And what effect does the socially held concept of women's role have on the development of female talent, on women's contribution to the society? Note, the research questions I suggested as major priorities in the above paragraphs remain valid and unanswered. Except for the last question, the distinction between values, prescriptive, and actual behavior, myth and reality of women's lives, researchers have ignored them. The major work in women's history has followed questions such as, how did women fight against oppression and improve their condition? Under what conditions and how did working women live and organize? What reform movements did women influence? How did women function in radical movements? A host of newer questions has been added by the introduction of the subjects of sexuality and gender. Female bonding and the way in which women related to other women have received considerable attention. Despite a few fine studies of women's work in one or another community organization, the larger study of women as a force in community development and in the maintenance of community institutions has yet to be undertaken. A study of the impact and consequences of long-range female educational deprivation has yet to be made. Finally, we come back to the initial problem of how to judge the contribution of women. Are women noteworthy when their achievement falls exactly in a category of achievement set up for men? Obviously not, for this is how they have been kept out of the history books up till now. Are women noteworthy then, as the early feminists tended to think, if they do anything at all? Not likely. The fact remains that women are different from men, and that their role in society and history is different from that of men. Different but equal in importance. Obviously, their achievements must also be measured on a different scale. To define and devise such a scale is difficult until the gaps in our historical knowledge about the actual contributions of women have been filled. This work remains to be done. But we already know enough about the subject to conclude that the roles women played at different times in our history have been changing. The patterns and significance of these changes, the continuities and discontinuities, the expectations and strivings of the pioneers, and the realities of the social scene, all these await study and new interpretations. One would hope at once for a wider framework and a narrower focus, a discarding of old categories, and a painstaking search of known sources for unknown meanings. It is an endeavor that should enlist the best talents of the profession, and at long last not primarily female talent. Note, the last sentence clearly demonstrates the limitations of my perspective at that time. Only a few years out of graduate school, I still believed that the only way women's history would gain respectability and acceptance was by winning over male historians to its practice. The growth of women's studies still lay ahead, and in my stance of lone voice crying in the wilderness, I had no inkling of the force, dynamism, and self-confidence academic women would bring to bear on their fields. I still welcome male historians to the field, and hope for their increasing awareness and understanding of its interpretations, but it is already clear that women historians are playing, and must continue to play, a primary role in restoring and interpreting the female past. This has been sort of a teaser chapter for the book club pick for August of 23. If I get around 10 people for the book club, then I'll publish these privately for those people throughout August, with a live discussion group at the end of the month, and then put them out for the general public at the beginning of September. If not, then I'll just record these at my own pace, not throughout August, but just whenever I feel like it, like I had been doing. If I get fewer than 10, then whoever signed up will just get some kind of $20 perk.